So what do you think?
For me to go into it, I think it's all comes down to a sense of inevitability that decks often need, especially combo decks. And whereas the Roach combo itself can be very consistent, what I like about adding a second possible backup plan or more very powerful ways to end the combo is it gives you even more inevitability in a way that also adds a bit of non-linearity to it. So your opponent can see you throw out roaches, but you might not necessarily have won the game off of them, but you still have many ways of winning the game by adding these cards to the deck.
Absolutely. All right, Mofu, let's get into this game. All right, so Ramp Dragon versus White Wolf. Classically, we know that White Wolf has a tiny edge against the old style of Ramp Dragon decks. Now that they're moving into this combo style, do you think that White Wolf still has the edge, or do you think it's a little too slow?
I feel like it's possible that White Wolf itself might not be the main win condition ever versus Ramp Dragon, but the fact that it only takes up 4 slots in the deck to really kind of contain that combo, so it's possible that even if he manages to draw a couple pieces of it, then Roach will still be the main win condition we see here. As for whether it actually goes off or not, I think like it could go any way there.
Right. So I guess the real question to kind of extend what we were talking about is why play the White Wolf package? Like, I know that it gives you other angles of attack, but it's really slow, right? So what are you trying to aim to play against with that? Like, is it really good against mid shadow because they can stall with, you know, certain wards on certain turns so you can go into the late game against them? Or do you think it's some other, you know, abstract thought?
I think it probably is targeting mid shadow or something along those lines, because whereas usually Roach is enough to take out control decks, and this is just because perhaps like Ramp Dragon doesn't really run a particularly great cache of wards or anything of that kind that really stops Roach or like delays him later. Decks like mid shadow have a lot of things that can just kind of get in the way, like Immortal Thane or otherwise. So possibly just looking for that matchup now could just come in really prepared for it, and we'll have to really see whether that works out later if he manages to get across.
That's true, and I really like the way the decks are built. I like all of today's decks. I went through the list before we started today, and everybody's got their own tech. They've got their own ways they're trying to win. They've got their own tutor cards. Like we see Kionys, you know, utilizing cards that we don't see in Dragon all the time, as such as Foresight and things like that. So it's just, they know what they're doing today, and I feel really confident that all the players today are going to show us everything that they have.
Yeah, I contrast even to round robin, whereas you know exactly what opponent you're facing. They know they have to face pretty much everyone else in a circle here, and I'm noticing that's bringing out a lot more creative tech and attempts to be unpredictable against many different types of opponents and matchups as opposed to usual.
That's right, and I really like the fact that people are going back to the old faithful decks. Like, we talk about OTK Roach off and on, you know, week in and week out, just depending on, you know, do people think it's strong this week? Is it good in their lineup? Is it, you know, yada, yada, yada. But when it comes push time, when it comes, I have to win this tournament, we see OTK Roach being fallen back on a lot. We see a lot of our players today bringing OTK Roach, and I think it's just because it's that consistent deck that's hard to counter, and if you practice it really well, it can really beat any other deck.
Yeah, and when there's a lot of people playing and a lot of people trying to counter each other's or many things that other people they know they're going to be playing against have brought, OTK Roach is probably one of the hardest decks to actually truly tech against. You can bring a ton of wards, but especially in the case of Meow, who has ways around that, it can't always really be a perfect way to guarantee that you won't somehow die to the combo, because Forest can just put up a fight throughout an entire game against it. So perhaps we could even say that during round robin, other types of Forest decks we've seen between aggro or neutral, it's a lot of testing, it's a lot of giving those decks a shot, or finding some sort of like less or more or less consistent matchups for other types of Forest. But Roach can really handle a lot of different things at once. It's a tool I really am not surprised to see everyone sort of falling back on when it comes to this.
Yep. And let's talk for a moment about new Sybil, okay? So now the new stats that we see on Sybil make it so much easier to clear her off the board. Like, we see Forest with the ability to actually just play a Pure-Hearted Singer and a Sylvan Justice and trade a Fairy into the Sybil, as opposed to before you would need to play a big follower to kill it, or you would need to have something like a Dance of Death to get it off the board. So I think that change makes Forest even just that slightly bit better in the mid game, because it doesn't have to worry about this ever-present Sybil that they have to deal with by using so many resources to get rid of it. As you see, Meow didn't even have to use an Evolution Orb to kill it.
Right. I think that just kind of demonstrates in Shadowverse, follower stats are extremely important. Whenever any change is really given to a follower, sometimes I mentioned this before, but increasing the cost is technically also a stat change. It's like what once used to be premium stats is now like -1/-1 behind. Or in Sybil's case, when it actually just straight up loses them, it loses the ability to mount a premium threat against the opponent that they have to deal with and commit a lot of resources to. In that case, we see it's not really so difficult to deal with, as you mentioned, Dragon in the mid game anymore, because they don't have something that both threatens 6 damage on board and forces out answers for 7. It used to be very difficult to evolve to trade into, but now it's much easier and a lot of removal hits it a lot more cleanly.
That's right. And what I like is it's actually positioning these dragon decks to make choices, right? And it's similar choices that they've been making all season. We see them go to this combo variation very frequently with Queen of the Dread Sea, Genesis Dragon, and either Erd or Ariat. But now it really feels truly like an OTK Roach deck should, right? Like your mid game can't, like, you know, your Fina, aka Sybil or whatever, can be dealt with rather easily. And now you're just pushing for your end game, and then your opponent can basically set up a board to stop it, like we said with wards, or to get to a high enough life total to not get OTK'd by the combo. So it really just feels like this big, maybe control-y type of combo deck, whereas before it just felt like it was so ever-present during the mid game, during the early game, during the late game, and I think that the early half of the deck has been toned down enough to where I think Dragon just feels really clean now. Like, you just know what it does. It doesn't do anything overly powerful before its end game, and I think it's in a really good spot right now.
Yeah, in the time that you mentioned, like pre-Sybil nerf and the like, you couldn't really get a powerful leg in against the deck often if it opened ideally. I mean, there always was this sort of weakness to Sybil where you can't play her before like the official 5th turn. But even then, it was always very easy to take her into Overflow, and often we would see Sybil just played standalone as a threat when Dragon and Control Mirrors or the like had nothing to do. And here we see Kionys kind of using her the same way, but the threat that it puts onto the board is just so much more minute that Meow can spend his entire game really just developing. He hasn't really been presented anything that he has to deal with that's really taking any resources out of him, still hasn't evolved yet.
Absolutely. And as we get into this endgame, we see that Meow has most of everything that he wants. He already has a White Wolf set up for 8. He already has Roaches in hand. He has what he needs. Kionys is just about a card off and a few damage off. So he needs to draw an Ariat or an Erd ASAP, and he can poke a little damage with these Dragoon Scythers, but he's got to do it quickly because that White Wolf will close the door pretty much the turn after it gets played if Kionys can't get to his combo in time.
Also worth mentioning that the tech of Crystalia Aaron can actually shrug off the poke from the Dragoon Scythers, so Kionys is really going to have to probably commit both of them face to get him into the ideal range of a Genesis Ariat if he wants to actually make it a complete combo. Which is always worth mentioning of, even though this is called Combo Dragon, it's kind of one of those interesting scenarios where it doesn't really ever do 20 damage in one turn. At most, ideally, the non-Erd version that actually does run Ariats, the way Kionys does, runs, or it evolves Genesis Dragon and hits for 9 twice, and that means that 2 extra poke damage is completely necessary to its game plan. It also is kind of vulnerable to wards like Crystalia Aaron. So how he actually gets through to getting that combo to be lethal damage is currently the puzzle that Kionys is facing.
That's right, and like you said, because of cards like Crystalia Aaron, even if the poke damage... Ooh, okay, he's just going to go in this turn. I was going to say, even if the poke damage did come in this turn, he could just play Crystalia Aaron, not play White Wolf, and just play a slower game after that aggressive turn he just had. But Kionys is like, I'm not waiting for that. I'm not going for a combo. I'm just going to see if you can't deal with this. And this is a smart play. I think this is an amazingly smart play.
I find this to be really interesting, right? Because while this is usually called Combo Dragon, Queen of the Dread Sea can do a lot of stuff. I've seen it used like this before. Even without Genesis Dragon, maybe to Bahamut the board and then put down a Polyphonic Roar. It's a full all-in that's really hard to answer. Meow isn't really running tough removal besides 2 copies of Dance of Death, so actually answering this position is really tough without using Roaches for it.
Right, and as we see, Meow does have all of the Roaches he does need. He set up enough damage last turn to where his double Roaches plus a Nature's Guidance can just finish out this game. I think Meow executed his game plan really well. I don't think a lot of players would have seen doing that extra poke damage on turn 7 before he went in. But I really like his game plan, and I like Kionys' follow-up. He knew he didn't have any time. He went for the win, but then Meow just had that one-turn advantage on him, and Meow's going to take this first game.
Really clean victory, and you can see how Meow had sort of, I mean, you already kind of lined out the poke that he went for, but he, despite drawing pieces of White Wolf, he to focus on to the amount of damage he had with Roach. He kept counting. He didn't allow the other parts of his deck that he added to increase the depth become distractions from the amount of damage he was just needing to count out there.
Absolutely. So now we get to see if Meow can take Mid Shadow into both OTK Roach and Dragon and finish out this match. I think Mid Shadow has a really good chance to do it. It's one of the best decks in the format. That's why we see a lot of our players bringing it. So let's see if Kionys can outlast this Mid Shadow deck.
I think this is a matchup that's represented very frequently. Even any type of ramp dragon has sort of just been its nemesis for this entire season, I feel like. The sheer amount of threat power that Dragon has always had and been able to ramp to is sometimes just not enough to deal with the sort of nefarious turn 7s of Shadow. So it's usually up until that point that the matchup really begins to develop.
That's right. It's really just, it comes down to how many board wipes do you have, how many board fills do you have if you're Meow, things like that. And he's got, it looks like tech for anti-control in here. We see him with the Attentive Knights. We see him with the Bone Chimeras in hand. He might not have a good curve. It might look super terrible. That's why you see it on his face right now. He's like, oh crap, what is his hand? But I think his hand's actually better than you would give it, you know, at first glance, give it credit for, because he has so much lasting power with it.
Yeah, worth mentioning actually, and I find this to be absolutely brilliant, is playing Attendant Knight Erd instead of other 3-drops and 2-drops into Prince Catacomb makes it so that his deck has a bit more of that ability to push in the mid game, as well as more sources of followers that are difficult to play board clears over. Because whereas, like, usually I see a very common game plan of Mid Shadow against Control is just trying to develop a lot of skeletons on board and push lethal with Ictor or something along those lines. But I think Meow has a sort of list that is specialized for doing exactly that. Followers that draw followers as they're cleared, things that are very resilient versus things like Bahamut or Israfil, as we see in Kionys' hand. So I think Meow's come really prepared for a lot of different matchups today. He has very interesting decks, and we'll see whether this really works for him.
That's right. And it comes down to it. It's just like, what do you expect your opponents to be playing, right? So we've noticed that Attentive Knight and the Erd combo has basically just disappeared from Mid Shadow. And that's because all season we saw a lot of aggro, right? We saw aggro Forest, we saw aggro Blood, we've even seen aggro Shadow, we've seen, you know, Burn Rune, you name it. Aggro exists. Attentive Knight comes back for those very specific situations where you think you don't have to play against aggro. And I think Meow, even being a new player this season, fully recognized that and said, you know what, I'm playing the value game.
I really like the play that he just developed there as well. This is a very, really strong use of Attendant of Night, is evolving it despite the fact that it can never really force a trade on its own. Develops two very tough questions for Kionys to answer here. So it really goes to show that Meow has also put a lot of thought into exactly how he wants to play out these cards that he's using.
So talk to me about the Haunted House card. So he only plays it as a one-of. It's a tech card. I've used it before in Mid Shadow just to push early games, maybe against other Mid Shadow decks, just because it gives you more value in trading with Bone Chimeras and all that kind of stuff. Do you think it's for a similar fashion instead of playing like more Odiles in his deck? Do you think it's for anything other than that?
Potentially. I think it's very, very interesting because he only does run one copy of it, so it's not a central point of his game plan. But I think it fits very neatly into this deck because he has a lot of cards in it that sort of sacrifice followers on his own side of the board. It is kind of strange to see Haunted House alongside 3 Lurching Corpses and 3 Attentive Knights, just cards that can't really make trades happen on their own. But because he can run them along this the synergies with like Soul Conversion and Demon Eater, and that's what really leads into being able to get those trades in despite running many followers that can't really hit. And that said, it isn't still necessary to the strategy. It's just a nice little bonus option that you kind of have in the deck.
Like, I almost like it this turn. Like, you play a Haunted House with the Erd. I know you just use the Evolution Orb to power up the Attentive Knight, but you can smash for 3, still do your Erd combo, and have the Haunted House to push for that 1 extra damage. And as we know, when it comes to playing against really slow decks, 1 extra damage can really add up over time.
Yeah, and he's already evolved the Attendant of Night and swung twice with it along that line of play, so he's already gotten 4 damage out of the Evo point. I think that's enough value to justify something like that, because it's a really, really tough board position to handle with anything short of having like a Sahak wheel in hand. He knows that Kionys isn't playing that kind of deck.
Yeah, it looks like that's what he's going to go with. I can't imagine an Erd not coming out here after that play. But Haunted House is one of those cards. I love Haunted House. I actually used to play it as a 2 of or a 3 of in my deck, just because of how much value it can generate. It also does this really neat trick with Ektar turns. Yes, it fills up one of your board slots, but of course Ektar doesn't do what it used to, right? It doesn't fill up your entire board. So you don't actually have to worry about it, you know, banishing the zombies that come out or anything like that. But you can trade your board away, get the 1/1 storms out, and then still push with Ektar. So it has this nice little, if I need to play a value game as well as dealing damage, I can do that.
One of the marked weaknesses of Shadowcraft as a class, sometimes I notice, is that this class doesn't really have a sort of trademark Storm follower. It has Deathly Tyrant, which Meow plays one of, but even that is a highly situational card. And so I think all cards that produce ghost tokens in the way that you've mentioned are always really, really interesting aspects of some cards, because Nyctar is the main source of damage in the deck, but it requires developed attackers to really get that value face. But ghosts really do add like this new dimension to how can I play out every board that I have in a way that also deals damage if that's what I'm trying to go for.
Right. And it has the added benefit, even if it's just the only card in play, if you need to play Ektar to trade, you can still poke that turn. So it's not completely dead as far as damage is concerned, dealing it to your opponent's face. So I like the value it adds, and as a 1-of, it's a nice little tech card that throws your opponent off, and that's exactly what you need to do in these high tension games, is do that one thing that your opponent wasn't expecting, or make that one play that they didn't account for to just push you over the edge in value, or, you know, the unexpected.
In fact, we're even seeing here, like, this is an immensely tough situation, and I think it is also partly accredited to Haunted House. The board that Meow has now, especially developing a Bone Chimera onto it, is capable of effectively trading into any one massive body that Kionys could play if Kionys was able to find a way to avoid a lethal. Though 9 play points is very rough. And so I think that really goes to say another thing about Haunted House is the ability to also turn little body generators like Bone Chimera into trade machines as well is another facet of how much utility it adds.
So here's a question for you. Is there a world where you soul conversion that Andrialphus to draw a card and poke for the additional 1 there? Is there any reason to just play the Andrialphus out and not soul convert it?
Considering Dragon going into turn 9, I actually really would have liked to see the soul conversion, but I suppose Meow might have thought, I already have 2 Ictors in hand, I already have another target for soul conversion that's quite easy to use in the Skull Beast or otherwise. Probably fine to just hold it there and let Kionys deal with it on his own, because Kionys being at such a low life total, having more on the board immediately could end up giving Meow a stronger board position.
Okay. So he goes up to 10. You can clear a lot of this off, but I don't think it's going to be anywhere near enough with those Ektars sitting in hand.
Nope. Being only locked to Israfil as his only option leaves up the skeletons, so Meow simply has the setup just like that.
Yep, we're looking at 11 damage in play. Meow's going to take this one very convincingly. Very convincingly. Meow's showing what's up. He prepared for this tournament. His Haunted House tech played off for him. His Attendant of Nights paid off for him. Very well done.
Indeed.
All right. Well, Meow takes the win there and moves out of the first round with a 2-0 win. I actually really like the way that his decks played out. I think that they were constructed very smartly. They did not look like they had too many holes to poke at, which I know a lot of Roach decks, I mean, there's such a... I think you have to tune them so finely because it